saying broadcast. I apologize for interrupting. It's not showing. Oh, there we go. Got it.
We are live now.
We are?
Yes.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay.
All right. And can I ask my co-presenters, are you able to see my slides?
Yes, we can.
All right.
And Nilda, I just want to confirm again that you're good.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. I'm going to bail out because, Carmen, I know that you don't need me.
Thank you, Bridget.
Always need you, Bridget.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Nilda.
And just an FYI, Kevin, participants should be able to enter at 2:44, I believe. I believe it's about a minute before where they can actually join.
Okay.
They may be in now. I don't see the count, but I believe I saw something pop up. It said now broadcasting.
It's actually just us. I believe someone maybe started.
Bridget left.
Right. So right now it's just the four of us.
Okay. So you'll give us a thumbs up when it's time to initiate and ensure that we're broadcasting.
Sure. Yep. We're currently we're recording, so this is what'll show up actually on the page for the session.
Okay.
But I'll send you a message to let you know once everybody starts coming in. But it'll be at 2:44. The participants will just start to flood in. But I'll let you know.
Okay.
That's fine. Thank you.
No problem. Good luck, guys.
Thank you. You too. Slides. You can see the slides advance. I'm double checking. Okay.
And Kevin, you can see the chat.
In advance when you're doing yours, or do I need to do that?
I can't advance. You're going to have to do it.
All right.
I have no control over them.
Okay. If I miss any, just give me a.
Yeah, I'll just say next or.
Okay.
And Kevin, I know you're sharing your screen. Do you have access to the chat window?
I do not.
Yeah, it would be distracting kind of to open it. We probably would rather just have you monitor it, Carmen.
Okay.
Is that okay?
No, that's fine. But if I need to send anybody a message, that's the only reason I would want to use it.
I would suggest using our phone because I don't want to keep my eye on the chat because there could be hundreds of messages coming through on that chat.
Okay.
I would suggest
or even
just text. I do not have Teams on. So
I do. I have Teams on.
I don't want another window open.
Gotcha. All right, attendees are starting to enter. We are at 57 and climbing.
Good. So it literally just opened 1 minute before or 2 minutes before.
Yep.
Carmen, this will be up to you. I noticed yesterday when one of the ones I was in, they flood in and then start to stabilize. And it may be a minute or two after the start time. That's perfectly okay for us to wait.
Okay.
If that's all right with you. Okay.
Absolutely. It's flooding in now, so I'll let you know when it kind of levels off.
Carmen, it looks like we're getting some people chatting already.
It does. I may have you all check the chat. Robin, looks like it's, well, I think it's fine. I put it to where attendees can chat with panelists and attendees.
After we get started, can we change that so that it's only to everyone?
You want to change it to, you said to everyone?
Yeah, so that we don't have a lot of chat coming up in the window.
Yeah, I tried to change that. It may be to where, I'm not sure if I have access to do that with co-host privileges.
Okay.
I just changed it. It may be to where Kevin would have to. Or I can try to, there we go.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thanks. All right, looks like we are at 400 and climbing now, guys.
I know there may be some participants who are going to continue to arrive. That's perfectly okay. We will go ahead and get started for the benefit of everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This session is on the new substantive change policy. We have a couple of handouts that are available for you if you would like to take advantage of those. Those are back over on the Pathable window, the browser window where you entered this meeting. And I believe just below the Join Meeting button is another window which has a tab called Files. Click on the Files tab, you'll see 2 PDF files that are there. You can download them now or after the session, either one. One is a copy of the slides, and you'll see pretty much everything that's on the slides that'll be on the screen, that you're seeing on the screen in the session today. And another is a crosswalk of the prior policy and the 2020 policy that was just recently approved. If you want to go ahead and grab those both, that's fine. You can grab them afterwards. You don't need either of them, but you're certainly welcome to follow along as we go through the material today. So thank you again for joining us. This is a 90-minute session, so we have a fair amount of material to cover. So bear with us. We are going to have an opportunity for questions and answers a couple of times during the session and at the end of the session. So those are planned in. We will be handling the questions through the chat window, so there's no need for you to enable your audio to be able to speak, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. As you can imagine, we have a large number of participants here today, so we will be taking a sampling of questions. And Ms. Carmen Gary, who many of you know because she is in charge of maintaining the off-campus instructional site database for SACSCOC. She is monitoring your questions throughout the duration of the session today, and she will be sharing some of those with us at the appointed time. So thank you again for joining us today. I'm Kevin Seitler. I'm on the SACSCOC staff, and I work in Substantive Change.
And hello, I'm Robin Suniga, and I'm also on the Substantive Change staff. Not sure why my picture isn't showing, but welcome. Glad to have you with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Robin. So we're going to, Robin and I are going to tag team on this and cover all the material that we have on deck for our session today. Some of you are probably aware that there is a new substantive change policy that has been in development for about a year. It is ready to roll out. So our session today is going to cover most of the high points of the new policy to give you a point at which to start beginning to learn and transition your institution to the new substantive change policy. Let me give you a roadmap of where we're going to go today and the material that we're going to cover and how we're going to cover it. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the rationale and the process and the context for the change in the substantive change policy, the process, and also the motivation for doing so. We're also going to cover some information on the implementation. That is how we're actually going to begin the process, how you may begin the process of transitioning to the new policy. Those are the bookends, and by far the most important content is wedged in between, and that is the content of the new policy. We're going to hit as many of the highlights as we can in our time together, and then in the implementation part, I'm going to give you some ideas or suggestions for helping begin that process for your institution. So let's jump right over to rationale and process to give you a little bit of context for the new substantive change policy. If you've been doing substantive change for a while, you probably have heard us say multiple times, well, we'll address this when the policy is revised. Well, that got put off for a while, but something happened last year that was the impetus for getting the new policy written and now to the point of implementation. Most of those came from federal regulations. Most of the changes, probably about 90% of the changes in the new policy are a direct result of changes in the federal regulations. And so as we go through some of these, I'll point out some of the ones that are and some that aren't a result of federal regulations, but by far, most of them are a result of what came into law earlier this year or late last year. Another part of the motivation, and these are the things we've asked you to hold on for a while, that we would add them to the policy at its next revision, are things that really needed to be clarified or were codified into the policy that were longstanding practices. I'll point a few of those out as we go through them. There was also some obsolete language and practices and terminology that just happens as you're developing policy and modifying it as needed over a period of time. I don't believe the policy has gone through a major revision in quite a long time, and I'm not sure it had ever been sort of taken down to the ground and rebuilt again. Everything was always done somewhat at the margin if something needed to be changed without looking at the entire policy. So in this revision, we started from scratch. So virtually everything you'll see in the new policy is brand new. Even if there was no material change in the content, we tried to certainly reorganize and rewrite most of that material, again, to try to make some things a little clearer, give a little bit more guidance on some areas of substantive change, while folding in all of the new additional requirements that were part of the federal regulations. I want to give you a quick overview of the process and how the new policy came into being. I hope most of you were able to hear Terry Hartle this morning as he was discussing, among other things, the Higher Education Act and the years-long expectation that piece of that law and the regulations that flow from it would be revised. Well, that hasn't happened and probably isn't going to happen. So what the Department of Education opted to do was to begin the negotiated rulemaking process for the regulations that flow from the law to address some things that they believe needed attention. And some of those affect institutions directly and indirectly through accreditation requirements. Those new regulations that were reached at consensus through the negotiated rulemaking process were finalized late last year. I believe they came out in November, and they were in the Federal Register probably in December or January of 2020. So the SACSCOC Board of Trustees opted in December to form an ad hoc committee to review the regulations and make recommendations for changes to the substantive change policy that were primarily a result of the change in regulations. So that was a representative committee. There were representatives from institutions in all states in which SACSCOC institutions are located. There were representations based on the type of institution, size, mission, HBCU. So it was a cross representation of institutions that were at the table that reviewed the regulations and made recommendations. That committee got started very early in the year after it was formed in December. That committee was under the the leadership of a board member who ushered, Brenda Kays ushered this through the entire process. Dr. Brenda Kays, who was president of Kilgore College, chaired that. And the committee met virtually in January and then all got together face-to-face in February of 2020 to hammer out what they were going to make as recommendations. That committee came up with 72 very specific recommendations that then went to the board, to the executive council of the board in March of this year. And all 72 of those recommendations were approved by the board. And then the process began to get that approved and get the policy written and the procedures written. Well, about March, I think all of our worlds turned upside down. And so some of our timeline for the development of the policy got pushed forward a little bit, took a little bit longer than anticipated. So instead of going to the board in June, it went to the board in September for its meeting, and the policy was approved then. After the policy was approved, then we set to work to write the procedures for the new policy, and that occurred in October and November. And then the entire policy and procedure, and the policy was published, was released to the membership in September after the September board meeting. And then the board just this, at the end of last week on Friday, they have passed and approved the entire policy and procedure document. So within a matter of days from the board approval, here we are today. I wanted you to see what that process was so you would understand that there was membership representation in this, even in the regulations for which there is no latitude by SACSCOC to say yay or nay that we're going to do it or not going to do it. It is in regulation and we're required to do that. Where there was discretion, that committee took a very hard look at what was required and what the implication would be, and they folded that into their recommendations to the board. So for today, I want to cover as many of the highlights as I can. So today, even though we have an hour and a half together, this really is going to be summary and highlights of the new policy. I want to make sure it's understood that this is certainly not even an exhaustive identification, let alone a discussion of what the new regulations could mean for different types of institutions, but we are hitting the things that we think are most important for you to get right out of the gate about the new policy. Now, the natural follow-up to that, of course, would be we will do some topic-specific training starting in January using our webinar platform. I know many of you have attended and participated in the Substantive Change webinars over the past couple of years. A number of those are out there. You can watch those on demand. That'll be the case for the ones that we start doing in 2021. But because the policy has changed pretty dramatically and touches almost all parts of the policy, we're going to take the prior webinars down in January as we start building out that additional set of webinars on very specific topics. So stay tuned for that. We will start rolling those out just as soon as possible, and we will get the new policy out to you just as soon as possible too. And I expect that to happen very, very soon. All right, so let's talk about the content of the policy. There is a way of presenting this information that you're going to see that is new, and you have seen us already incorporating that into some of the webinar training and other materials that we've prepared over the last 6 or 8 months or so. But we have reorganized how we are presenting different types of substantive change. So here's an organizational paradigm that you're going to see in a number of contexts, particularly with respect to the new policy. And that is, we've taken changes and divided them into some categories. Now, these categories aren't mutually exclusive. There are changes that you will make at your institution that fit into more than one category. But let me identify what they are, and then we're going to walk through each one of those and talk about some of the specific substantive changes under each of those categories that are new or different in the new policy. One type or one category of change are institutional changes. These are things that are more global. They apply to the entire institution. There are a few things that had been program or site changes before that are now going to be institutional changes. These are oftentimes things that institutions will go through only once or a very few times in any intermediate period of time at an institution, like a merger or consolidation, an institution, acquisition of an institution, a mission change, change of institutional governance. But these are things that are very broad across the entire institution. In addition to institutional changes are program changes. This is probably the largest category of substantive changes, changes related to academic programs at your institution. It is also the category that probably has the most changes to it as well, if for no other reason, just by virtue of the number of sub-changes that are actually program changes. Another that you deal with all the time, we've mentioned this earlier already, and that is off-campus instructional sites. Many of you are significantly expanding the geographic footprint of your institutions, and so there are things that have to take place as you are expanding beyond your campus and beyond national and state boundaries. Ms. Gary, who you probably heard us mention at the very beginning, who is our monitor for today, is in my office, in the Substantive Change office, and that is her bailiwick. She is in charge of maintaining that database. Last I remember, it was around 7,000 or 8,000 open sites. I don't know how many total we have, including closed sites, but it's well into probably 15 to 20,000 sites in total. But right now, about 7,000 or 8,000 sites, I believe, in 48 states. So our footprint, your footprint, certainly extends far beyond the boundaries of your on-campus footprint. Now, another type of a category of changes that we're going to cover today, and there's not a separate category of this in the policy, but those are general, for lack of a better term, I'm just going to call it general changes. And these are changes that really span more than one of those types of categories. As I mentioned, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So that's a little bit of the background and a map of where we're going to go with our discussion today. So now we're going to go through each of these categories of subtypes of substantive change and identify, again, the highlights, those things that we believe are the most significant or most immediate impact on the institution. And we'll go through each of those in turn. After we go through the first two, institutional and program changes, we'll stop for a moment, do a check in with you and take a few questions. Then we'll pick back up with the off-campus instructional site, general changes, and we'll have time for more questions then. So for the program changes, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Zuniga.
What is the phrase we use in Zoom now? You're muted? I was still muted. So we're going to start with the institutional changes, not the program changes. There's at least one very key new institutional change that we really feel that you need to know about. And as Dr. Seitler was just saying, these are highlights. Institutional changes still include many of the things that have always been on institutional changes, such as mergers and consolidations and acquisitions. All of those things remain in the policy. But there are some new critical things that have changed that we really want you to know about. So the one that's probably going to be the most important for you to know about right now is the new policy for institutional contingency teach-out plans. This is a very new requirement that came from the rules and regulations, the new negotiated rulemaking. And keep in mind, it is a contingency teach-out plan. It only comes into play as a precaution. It's something to ensure that you have adequate institutional planning ahead of any changes that might lead to the closing of the institution. It doesn't mean that the institution is closing or that it's imminent. It just means that some things might be going on that we want to make sure that you have a plan in place for closing if something should happen. So keep in mind that it doesn't mean that a closure is imminent. You will be able to see in Appendix A of the new procedures all of the things that are required for the contingency teach-out plan. And keep in mind that it's going to be comprehensive. It's going to deal with all aspects of the institutions. You'll need to have a teach-out plan for every program at the institution and every student, including giving a list of students in their program and where they are at the institution. Another thing that you'll need to do is to identify potential teach-out partners that have similar programs that could take your students if you were teaching out that program if the institution closed. However, teach-out agreements themselves are optional. You are not required to actually present teach-out agreements, but you do need to identify those programs that you could send your students to if that should become necessary. Okay, so you're not required to do an institutional contingency teach-out plan unless certain circumstances exist, and probably the most pressing of those would be if you were placed on institutional probation by SACSCOC. If you are put on probation, your vice president is going to talk to you about the fact that you're going to need to submit an institutional contingency teach-out plan. Of course, if SACSCOC ends your accreditation, that would also be the case, but if you're going to be on probation first, probably before that happens. So when you go on probation, you would be preparing that plan. Other things, though, outside of SACSCOC may impact you and may make a contingency teach-out plan required, such as having your state's authorization revoked for the institution, or probably more commonly, having being put on some kind of status with the U.S. Department of Education, such as being on provisional certification for your financial aid, or being on reimbursement for financial aid, or on some kind of emergency status or action by the U.S. Department of Education. All of these would trigger the need for the contingency teach-out plan. And remember, these are circumstances that are for future reference. It doesn't mean that your institution is imminently closing. It just means that there are certain circumstances which might lead to a future closure, and so the point is to have a plan in place in case something happens. Okay, let's look at program changes now. There are a number of things that have changed in program changes, and as Dr. Seitler was saying, program changes are probably the most numerous changes for an institution. And there are some significant new notifications regarding programs that you need to be aware of. You know, in the past, we'd often tell you not to submit anything for a lot of different things. You'd notify us and we would tell you, don't notify us. Well, that's changing. There are now some things that we used to tell you were not notifications that will now be notifications. So if you have a new program that is going to have 25 to 40% new disciplinary content, you will now need to notify us. Also, if you are adding any additional methods of delivery to an existing program. So in the past, when you would get approval for your distance education, we would tell you, you don't need to tell us if you're changing another program to distance education. Well, that is not the case anymore in the new policy. Now, if you are moving, say you have a Bachelor of Science in Nursing program that you have been teaching by a distance education, but now you're going to add a face-to-face component to that, you would need to notify SACSCOC of that change, and vice versa if you went from face-to-face to distance education. The same is true with competency-based education. If you go from a traditional curriculum and you add a competency-based curriculum or replace a face-to-face traditional with a competency-based, you need to notify SACSCOC. So now there are new notifications that you do have to make. Now, however, this is only going forward. Please, please do not go back and tell us about everything that you have done from last 5 years or 10 years of changing new programs or adding additional modes of delivery. This only applies to January 1st going forward. Don't send us everything from the past, just going forward. Okay. Also, course and credit-based competency-based education was never a requirement before. In the past, you had to get approval or notification if you went to direct assessment competency-based education. Now there are requirements also for course and credit-based competency education, where the competencies and the demonstration of competencies are embedded within courses and where credit is earned for those courses as part of the competency-based program. So we now have a requirement that at the institutional level, so this really falls under the institutional rubric, you are required to send in a prospectus to have the first program of course credit-based, competency-based education, that's a mouthful, approved over 50%. So this is the first time that you've had to do that. Thereafter, we then go back to the notification procedure. So subsequent changes to credit, course and credit-based, competency-based education for existing programs are notifications. Of course, as always, any change, if it's a significant departure for the institution, becomes a significant departure prospectus, regardless of whether it would be a notification for some other reason. So that is a good segue into talking about new programs, because there are some significant changes to the new programs as well. In the past, you know, we had a set of questions that we call guiding questions for you to go through and evaluate a new program and decide if it's a significant departure. We've often told you that those are indicators, and they're indicators of new content that the program is bringing to the institution that it has not previously taught before. For the first time, we are now defining significant departure numerically. So significant departure is now, you can consider it a program where 50% or more of the disciplinary content is new. In other words, subtract the general education, look at the disciplinary content of the program, and then calculate what percentage of the content in that program is new and what percentage is coming from existing content. And once you're at 50%, then you have an obligation to submit your prospectus for a significant departure. So this is the first time that we have actually set a numerical threshold. You'll notice that it's higher than the presumptive threshold that we used to have. We used to have a presumptive threshold of about 25 to 33%, and it is now 50%. So that should both, I hope, clarify what a significant departure is, make it easier to identify a significant departure, and reduce the number of programs that are submitted with a prospectus as a significant departure. Kevin?
Thank you very much, Dr. Zuniga. There are, and I may have said this at the very beginning, there's a lot of volume that we're going to cover today. And so I know what the natural tendency is, and that's to jump to the bottom line and try to determine what this means for your institution for a particular type of change. And as important as that is, it might be a better use of time and energy to try to absorb the scope of the changes before thinking through to the implementation of, well, what do I now have to do? I was looking at the names of folks as the session was starting today. I know many of you by name, if not having spent time with you face to face. I know how many of you operate, and I know you want to know, bottom line, what do I have to actually do for this? As important as that is at this point, take a step or two back and look at it from a broader perspective. Perhaps you can do it however you want to. I'm just making this as a suggestion based on how I have observed how many of you operate and the discussions that we've had, and just try to take all of that in to understand the scope of the changes, and then a little bit later, you have some time decide how that's going to impact your particular institution. So thank you for those. We're going to move on and talk about some other. These are still program changes. So let me point out a few others to you. I think the last thing that Dr. Zuniga discussed with you on new programs, where we're making significant departure determinations, was very difficult because the guidance was just not there. And there was also nothing in policy that gave any quantitative threshold for that. We've tried to address those, and we're doing that with a couple of others too. And you're going to see this one in slide after next. But let me first spend a couple of minutes talking about cooperative academic arrangements. For those of you who are early birds and grabbed the the slides early on, there was the wrong word in there. It said collaborative academic arrangements. I corrected that. So if you got it after about 10 o'clock this morning, you have the correct version. If you don't, just strike through that if you're relying on the notes for cooperative academic arrangements. Now, there are a number of things that fold into this. So let me unpack them sort of one at a time. Cooperative academic arrangements are one element of the sub-change policy that is directly tied to a particular standard, and this ties to standard 10.9, which is also called cooperative academic arrangements. Just so you know, that what was in the policy before for collaborative academic, I beg your pardon, for cooperative academic arrangements has not changed. So this is when you're engaging in relationships with other institutions or entities and you're recording those credits earned by students as being awarded by your own institution. All of that stays the same. You also recall that there are two criteria in the current policy, either of which are met would qualify a relationship with another institution or entity for notification. And these are for cooperative academic arrangements. These are notifications. One exception I'll tell you about in just a moment. So that part of the policy has not changed. It is still tied to standard 10.9. The content of that has not changed. There are still two criteria that are used, either of which, if they're met, qualifies that type of engagement, and it does require notification. But here's what we have done, and some of you have seen these terms used for quite a while in the substantive change policy without really knowing exactly what they mean, and that is contractual or consortial relationships. What we've done is folded those into the definition of cooperative academic arrangements. So anything that you're doing through a consortial relationship with another institution where you're recording the credits earned at those partnering institutions as your own, as awarded by your institution, through some type of contractual arrangement with another institution or entity, those are all being collapsed into cooperative academic arrangements. Again, no change to the current policy. But here's something else that we have done to fold in another existing requirement into the current policy, and we're also calling those cooperative academic arrangements, and that is arrangements with institutions or entities that are not Title IV certified. This has been in policy as well. I think we just called it relationship with an entity that's not Title IV certified. Now we're simply calling it, just like we do other cooperative academic arrangements, it's a cooperative academic arrangement that happens to be with an entity that is not Title IV certified. These are also a good example of requirements that come directly from the federal regulations. So SACSCOC has an obligation to, with you, vet those type of relationships that you develop with these institutions or entities when they may not be traditional educational institutions. The students who are attending those are not eligible. The institution is not eligible and is not participating in Title IV federal funds programs. And those require either notification or approval. And those are dependent on the percentage of content that you are offering through this relationship with another entity. So there are now three types of cooperative academic arrangements. There's the one that's always been there, and that has not changed. It does now fold in what we in the past called contractual or consortial relationships. And then we also have cooperative academic arrangements with non-Title IV entities, and it could require either notification or approval depending on the percentage of your program that is being delivered in cooperation with this additional party or parties. Okay. Here's another program change where we have finally tied a metric to what the threshold is for approval, and that is changing the length of a program. This applies to increases or decreases in program length. We have now pegged the metric for that at 25%. If there is a change of 25% or more for an increase or decrease, that may trigger a need to have the length of the program reviewed and approved prior to implementation. But here's another thing that we have done. We have added a second criterion. Not only is it 25% or more, but also changes the expected time to completion for the typical student in the program. So now for a change in program length to require approval, it has to cross that numeric threshold of 25% and impact the expected time to completion by one term or more, or the equivalent of one term if you're in a non-time-based program like competency-based education. Now, the reason we did that was there are no minimum hours for some programs, certificate programs, diploma programs, except those that your institution or state or system impose. What was happening was, particularly for lower number of total hours required, adding a single course could require a approval prior to implementation, adding or taking out maybe a 3 credit hour course or even less. So this additional criterion keeps some of those from triggering just based on the percentage, where it had a disproportionate effect on smaller programs or programs that required fewer credit hours. Okay, some more program changes, and these again are hopefully going to clarify what the thresholds and requirements are, rather than creating additional obligations for you. There are plenty of things that are creating additional obligations, so here are some where you're getting some relief. One is how we're defining dual academic awards. You know these better than I. These have really expanded in number over the past couple of years. And what we were finding more and more of these being reported as dual degree programs really were not. They were pathway programs, say from an associate to a baccalaureate. It was really an articulation agreement, or going from an undergraduate to a graduate degree, or even from a master's to a doctoral degree program, where there was some arrangement for courses being able to count, let's say, graduate courses for undergraduate requirements, an accelerated program. Those really aren't dual degree programs, I believe, as originally intended. So we have added, as part of the definition of a dual academic award, degree or otherwise, is that it's at the same program or the same credential level. So 2 masters, 2 baccalaureates, not baccalaureate to masters or baccalaureate to doctorate, which is very, very common type of arrangements. So hopefully that takes some of the things off of your plate that you would have to consider a dual academic award. Here is one thing that we removed from the policy. Now, what follows is something that is related to this, that is being added in, but one of the things that was taken out was approval for degree completion programs, categorical approval for degree completion programs. If you've ever had to deal with these, you know what is in the policy really addressed not necessarily degree completion, but accelerated delivery, which is common for degree completion programs, but they're not the same thing. So what the committee that was charged with looking at our policy recommended was, let's get rid of that, and that is what happened. So as a category, that is no longer a requirement. Here is a requirement that is somewhat related to that is related oftentimes to degree completion programs. This is a new requirement that was in the 2019 negotiated rules that are now a requirement, and that is programs designed for prior learning. And we defined and came up with the definition to get to put some clarity around what this means operationally. Is we defined it as prior learning as being a condition of admission. So a person would have to be able to demonstrate entering a program that they have a certain type or level of prior learning that the institution validates as part of the admission requirement for a program. It requires a review of institutional practices for awarding credit for prior learning, which you have an obligation to do that anyway. That particular piece of it is not new. So programs designed for prior learning do create an obligation, and it's a notification for most institutions. There's one exception, and I'll point that out to you when we get a little bit further along in our discussion today. Now, that covers the highlights, again, of the institutional and program changes. So let's stop for a moment and do a check-in on some questions. And Ms. Gary has been monitoring those questions if you've been putting them in the chat. So Ms. Gary, could you offer us some questions, and we'll try to answer a few of those, and then we'll move on to the next section.
Sure, Kevin, and I think Robin she's been monitoring it as well. So we've been chatting back and forth. So I think she's going to take some of the questions too. But one main question has really been on timing, and what policy, if submissions are being submitted before the 12/21 deadline, should it be submitted under the old policy or the new policy?
Yeah, that's a good question, and maybe I could have headed that question off to relieve a little bit of anxiety. Right now, our policies, whenever policies are approved, they go into effect immediately. Okay, that has always been the case. So this is now policy. The new substantive change policy is the policy. However, we're, if nothing else, very realistic about how these things happen. Here's the situation. January 1st is the deadline for submitting anything that you're going to implement in the second half of 2021. So January 1st is the deadline for implementations from July 1st to the end of December in 2021. If you meet that deadline, you're fine, which you should be meeting that deadline anyway. We are not going to apply the new policy to anything submitted by the January 1st deadline. If you have something that's ready to go, and I think we're closed on actually closed on the 1st, and I think the first day we open is January the 4th. Look, if it comes in that first part of that week, fine, no problem. Make sure you put a date on it and you try to send it off before the 1st. It's going to be okay. So we do have to hold institutions accountable to this. For example, the institutional contingency teach out plan, that actually went into effect with institutions in September. So those institutions that were placed on probation are already doing those things. We have an obligation to do those for us to remain in compliance. But for you, it's anything submitted after the January 1st deadline will be expected to comport with the new policy. So the next deadline would be really for the CNR, which is anything that goes to the full board, and that deadline is March 15th. So you have until now, until you submit for the March 15th deadline for anything that must go to the full board in June. Afterwards, it would be July 1st would be your next deadline for things that don't have to go to the full board, which is by far the large majority of things you submit for substantive change don't go to the full board. If they require to go to the board at all, they go to the executive committee. That happens, executive council, that happens year round. So you've got at least 6 months or so, aside from anything that's on deck now that would need to come in by the January 1st deadline. So that's a long answer to basically say, if it comes in before the January 1 deadline, it'll be evaluated against the old, the prior policy. Anything after that will be under the new policy. So thank you for that question.
And can you also clarify if the new policy is posted, Kevin? We're getting several questions about that. Yeah,
good question. No, it's not posted. As I mentioned, the board signed off on it. The board meeting ended on Friday. There are a few things that have to happen before it can be posted. These are mostly sort of technical things that have to be done with links and formatting and clearances and that sort of thing. It should be up very soon. I can't tell you the exact time because that's kind of outside of the realm of my control, but it will be very soon. If you are all on the listserv of institutions in the southern region, I'll put something out on the listserv. It'll be on the Substantive Change website. You will know it if you keep your ear to the ground when it's out. But it'll be as soon as possible, and it'll be very soon. Okay.
Okay, Robin, did you want to take it over, or do you want me to continue?
Kevin,
let's, in the interest of time, let's go ahead and move on, and we'll come back to some of the questions as we get toward the end. Okay. All right. So thank you for those questions. We will get to as many of them as we can, and we will open it up for general questions at the end of the session as well. So let's shift gears now and talk about off-campus instructional sites for just a few moments. Now, this one is going to take a while because this one does create some new obligations for your institution that have not existed before. So let's walk through it as deliberately as we can, and we'll point out what these new requirements are. This was also an example of something that was in the regulations. We have an obligation to do this. This is non-negotiable. So this is a new requirement that applies to every institution in the United States that is covered under an accreditor that is USDE recognized accreditor. Off-campus instructional sites hereafter will be of two types: an extensive review or a limited review. That's for any site that requires approval. All right. For most institutions, that's going to be if over half of a program is delivered at a site, the site requires approval prior to implementation. The new requirements are every institution must go through at least 2 reviews by extensive review. And an extensive review is an institutional level review. So an extensive review goes to the full board of trustees. There's 2 opportunities a year for that to happen, in June and December. It is a review of the site itself, and it is a review of the institution. All institutions must go through their first 2 sites approved after the implementation of the policy. Those sites have to go through extensive review. That is independent of any previously approved sites that the institution may have already had approved in the past. So this applies equally to all institutions, whether this is your first off-campus instructional site or your 101st. If it's the first one approved under the new policy, it must go through an extensive review. The extensive review looks at the administrative capacity and the institutional finances of the institution to assure the institution has the capacity to successfully operate instruction or deliver instruction apart from its main campus. It also reviews the site, as all new site approvals do, which is the physical site, how the institution is going to pay and maintain the site, how the qualifications of faculty who are assigned to teach at the site, and how students have the same access to student and learning support that any student on your campus would have, such that a student is not disadvantaged because they are enrolled in instruction outside of the main campus. This is reviewed by the board, by the full board, so it requires a prospectus. So March 15th would be the deadline for a new off-campus instructional site if you don't submit the prospectus by the January 1st deadline. That would be reviewed by the board. If it is approved, that would count as, let's just say you're submitting a prospectus for one site, that would be your first site approved. You would still have an obligation to have another site approved through the extensive review process before you're eligible for what for most of you will be the majority of your reviews after you have had your first 2 approved through extensive review, and that is review by a limited review. A limited review is closer to what the process that you are used to now, which is writing the prospectus, submitting it by the deadline based on when you plan to implement. It is reviewed by staff. It does not have to go to the full board or a committee of the board. We look at the site itself, its faculty, the finances for the site. So it's the marginal cost of the site, not a review of the institutional finances and their capacity and stability, and access to student and learning support. We do that for every site now. That then goes to the executive council. That happens year-round. Many of you are familiar with this process. So the limited review is very similar to the process that we are using now. The prospectus is pared down, so you have less to include in a limited review. Not a lot different, but it is a pared down version of the prospectus if you've done one before now. That applies to a limited review after your first 2 are approved through an extensive review. All right. Now, there's not a slide for this, but let me explain one other option for approval by extensive review. If you go through reaffirmation, and once the board takes positive action on your reaffirmation, if there was a site or sites offering over half of a program that is an already approved site that was included with the material that you submitted at the beginning of your reaffirmation cycle, and you successfully go through reaffirmation, then those sites are considered approved by extensive review by virtue of your reaffirmation. That applies to any institution that was reaffirmed in September, that was postponed from June, and any that will be or have been reaffirmed in the December 2020 meeting. If you're in either of those reaffirmation classes and you had approved sites at the beginning of your reaffirmation review process, those sites already approved will be considered approved by extensive review. So if you have additional sites that you want to have approved in the future, you are qualified to submit a prospectus and have it reviewed as a limited review. So if you're going through reaffirmation, those sites, if they were included and were vetted by the review committees, those sites are considered approved by extensive review. And then you are eligible for subsequent site approvals by limited review. If that's not the case and you're ready to start a new program, then that prospectus will have to go through the extensive review process. Slightly larger prospectus than limited review, can't be reviewed by staff, goes to the full board. Okay. There are some operational issues with how we're going to handle some of those things. Don't worry about it. We're going to get to those. If you happen to be in the September or December reaffirmation classes and you think you're qualified for that, it's fine. We're going to get in touch with you. We will let you know in pretty short order that you are already approved. You've had at least 2 sites approved through the extensive review. Okay. The new regulations do put a lot of emphasis on locations and how students are treated and have access and are taught out when they're at an off-campus instructional site. Those sites are growing very fast. So if I were reading between the lines, I would say it really is sort of a risk mitigation, perhaps, motivation for including that in the new regulations. But it is an extra step, and it is a more arduous review process and a more time-consuming review process for those first 2 sites that have to be approved through the extensive review process. Okay. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Zuniga, and she's going to begin our discussion on closures.
I do see a lot of questions on the extensive review, and believe me, we will get back to that in a few minutes. But let's talk about closures for a minute, because there are some things that are changing about closures as well, although maybe not as significantly as the extensive and limited review. In the past, we have, most institutions have been setting in closures for those institutions which they notified us, sites where they notified us that they were going to have a site. But that was never in policy. It was a practice that many of you pursued, and it was a practice for us as well, but it wasn't in policy. Now it is. So any sites that you have notified us of having reached the threshold of 25% now require in policy that they be closed officially by submitting a letter and a teach-out plan. Also, previously in policy, there was a clause that allowed you to self-designate a site as inactive without closing it, and maybe keep it without students or programs for a limited amount of time, and then when you decided to close it, let us know. That is no longer in policy. Officially now, either a site is open with SACSCOC or it's closed. There is no inactive status, and you are not allowed to just designate a site as inactive. You do need to submit the teach-out plan. Now keep in mind that sites that are closed can still be reopened with a notification if you reopen them within 5 years. That has not changed. So while this practice is now coded in policy that you need to close the programs and that there is no inactive status, you still have the option of reopening a site within 5 years with a letter of notification. Okay? So the changes in site approvals from extensive to limited review for the first two, it eliminates some of the exceptions that we had in policy that allowed you to submit modified prospectuses, or for instance the workforce development certificate programs where you were only approved for that workforce development certificate at that site. That has been removed because now once you have your two extensive reviews, you basically are submitting a modified prospectus through the limited review process, so there's no reason to have a separate workforce development certificate program. Let's see. The other thing that we have clarified in the policy is also something that was true in practice but had not been codified in policy, and that was when international off-campus instructional sites needed to be visited. Now, of course, if an international site is one of your first 3 sites, it will still need a visit, but it won't automatically need a visit as long as it's not one of the first 3 sites or a branch campus, which also requires a visit. Unless those 2 things apply, international sites will only be visited for the first international site as required. After that, it will be at the discretion of SACSCOC, and we will be looking instead to see if you have a history of having international sites that are operating well, and confer with your vice president about whether a site visit is actually needed for the international sites. So it won't automatically be a site visit for an international site, which may have happened in the past. So we have reduced, hopefully, the number of site visits that are necessary. So now we're going to go back to questions, and I saw that we have many, many questions coming in, Carmen.
We do. Let me scroll up. Now, I've seen many questions that are asking for clarification on the extensive reviews. If you have a sub-change visit that's part of the 5th year, does that count as an extensive review?
That's a good question, and the answer is no, it does not. This would apply only to reaffirmations. It does not apply to 5th year review. One of the reasons for that is because what is vetted as part of extensive review, if you write a prospectus and it goes to the board, is administrative structure, administrative capacity, specifically for supporting off-campus instructional site, and a review of institutional finances. And the decision was that the review at the 5th year was not sufficient to qualify as an extensive review. So that's limited only to reaffirmations. It does not extend to 5th year reviews.
Okay, and there are other questions asking for clarification on the timeline. They're wanting to know if this is correct, if institutions who underwent on-site visits in fall of 2020 are exempt from the extensive review requirement.
It's if institutions had board actions that positive action on their reaffirmation in December of 2020. If their on-sites were in the fall, and actually I'm not sure that if their on-sites were in the fall, they would be eligible to go to the board in December. I don't know, but it really isn't dependent on when the visit is. It's when the board takes action on the reaffirmation. That's the timeline for or that's the qualifier for inclusion of the sites at reaffirmation would be for this December or for in September of 2020. Those would be considered approved, invariant to when the reaffirmation on-site visit is. So I would tag that to board, positive board action on reaffirmation, not when the visit was. It has to be when the board action is. Now, if your on-site was in the fall and your you're coming up for board action on your reaffirmation in June, then you would have until June, between now and June, if you wanted to open a new program, it would still have to go through extensive review. After June, when the board takes action and you had those sites that were included at the beginning of your reaffirmation that were already approved, they would then be considered approved by extensive review, and thereafter you could submit a prospectus for a limited review. But it's tied to the board action for this alternate method rather than submitting a prospectus, the alternate method being by virtue of reaffirmation.
Great. And Kevin, can you clarify if reopening a site within 5 years will trigger extensive reviews if they have not had 2 extensive reviews yet?
That's a good question. We sort of talked that through. You won't find this anywhere in policy. I don't think we're going to hold institutions to that they could reopen that site. It would not trigger an extensive review. That is subject to change. So like many things, when we have a new policy, not every possible contingency is folded into the mix. Even if we could, we wouldn't do that. So we'll have to see. I would say right now, our guidance is no, you can still reopen it without it triggering an extensive review. Reopening programs and reopening sites, that was not in the prior policy anywhere, but it's been a long-standing practice. So as Dr. Zuniga pointed out, we've been doing this for a while anyway. We've now just codified it and allowed you to reopen those programs within, right now it's 5 years, within 5 years of the date of closure of the site or a program. And that's just a notification. You just have to let us know. That's a good question, but right now that will not trigger the need for an extensive review. I will tell you this, however, we did have to add an additional requirement for reopening sites and relocating sites, is that if you reopen a site, that site is ineligible to be relocated until you finished 1 term. And unfortunately, what happened was institutions were reopening sites and immediately submitting a relocation. So they were opening brand new sites without them being vetted, and we had to close that. Loop. So that's an additional requirement. Now, if you're reopening, that site has to enroll and finish a term before it's eligible. If you're going to relocate it, you're going to close or end instruction at one location and move it somewhere else.
Okay, and can you restate the requirement criteria for extensive review? At least 2 in what window?
Well, until you have 2. So whatever window of time that is, we'll start counting sites approved by extensive review. We've already started doing that with those that went through reaffirmation in September. If you submit a prospectus for extensive review after January 1st, which is when you would have to if you were going to open a new site and you didn't submit before January 1st, that would go through extensive review. We would start counting with that one. So there's not a window of time, it's just the number over whatever period of time it happens to be. Many institutions open and close sites all the time. You're going to hit that threshold pretty quickly. Others do this very rarely. It may take several years before, if ever, before you had to have a site approved by extensive review or got over the threshold that would allow you to have a review through a limited review. So it's the number, not the time.
Great. And we have several more questions. Should I continue, or do you need
Let's go ahead and take one more. We have about 30 minutes remaining and we still have a fair amount of material to cover, but let's go ahead and get one more.
Oh, okay. Do you have any guidance on lead time expected for the submission of an enhanced prospectus? Deadline?
For the extensive review?
Yes.
Well, because extensive reviews have to go to the board, they would be due by, let's say this is coming June, your deadline would be March 15th. So if it's going to go to the December, that deadline is in the December meeting, the deadline is in September. So those deadlines are defined. Ironically, the lead time is a little bit shorter for things that have to go to the full board than they have to be reviewed by staff, just because of volume, because of how many we get, prospectuses we get, and that's a little unpredictable. So completion times for normal submissions for prospectuses is about 4 to 6 months. Let's say if you're going to submit an extensive review prospectus that you want to implement in July, and you don't get it in by January 1st, you could submit it March 15th, and it would be on deck for review at the June 2021 board meeting. That same that same pattern would repeat for subsequent years.
Okay, and Kevin, does extensive review apply equally to off-campus instructional sites for dual enrollment at high schools?
Yes, remember dual enrollment as it relates to an off-campus instructional site is really not a particularly meaningful designation. All off-campus instructional sites are off-campus instructional sites, whether they're dual enrollment or otherwise. So there's no additional requirements for dual enrollment, but there's also no exception for requirements for dual enrollment sites, students, programs, faculty, learning support, i.e. everything. It's all, there are no differences for dual enrollment, and that would extend to off-campus instructional sites as well. Okay, so thank you for those questions, and we'll come back. Again, we'll try to get to as many of these as we possibly can. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Zuniga for some general changes. And these are, for lack of a better term, these really apply to multiple categories. So they're institutional, site, program, or something even more general than that. Dr. Zuniga?
Right. These are cross-cutting changes. In other words, they might apply equally to programs, institutional changes, or sites. So let's go over these a little bit. So another thing that was a practice that is now in policy is that when it comes to closures and the requirement to submit a teach out when something closes, we have clarified the expectations that you need to send in a closure when you're ending any completion option. So it's not just closing a program or closing a site per se, but if you're closing a program at a location, that is closing a completion option for the student. And the same with the method of delivery. So if you had a program, again, that was being offered through distance education, and you decided to close that and only have it face-to-face, you're closing an option for the students to complete that program. And the purpose for clarifying this is that we want to make sure that students have the completion options that will minimize their disruption towards their degree and minimize any extra costs that they might have to acquire their degree. So these are as important changes for a student as closing an entire program or an entire site. So even if a program is staying open at the main campus or at another location, if you're closing it at a particular location or closing a particular method of delivery, now you're expected to submit a teach out for approval.
Thank you for that. We have been giving this guidance for institutions for several years now, and we have simply added this to the policy. When you ask for guidance, if it's not in policy, we can say, here's what we would suggest that you do. And you can do it or not. It's at your discretion. But if you ask, we will tell you what we would suggest. You can, like any advice, you can take it or not. It was decided to add this, though, because there were instances where students were being left with no completion options. And so now anytime a completion option is ended, the institution has to make a good faith effort to find reasonable completion options for the students, those students that are affected.
But can I just add, Kevin, that as always, it has always been that you're expected to submit your teach out before you close the plan, before you close the program or the site. It's supposed to be sent when you make the decision to close. Now, we do often get closures for programs and sites that have already closed, there are no more students. And your teach out plan can say it is inactive, we don't have any more students, and we will accept that and close the program or the site. But we often will send a note to you at that time reminding you that you have your obligation is to send us a teach out plan at the time that you make the decision to close, because the purpose of a teach out is for us to ensure that the students are being given ample opportunity to complete their credential program. So it would make no sense to just be closing it once the students are already gone. There's nothing to vet at that point.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, and we get sometimes you don't make the decision to close and then you teach out the students. You close the program because there are no more students, because the program has sort of run its course. Yeah, look, we get that. So if you send your closure after there are no more students and you explain why, then that's perfectly okay. We know how that works. All right, let's shift gears a little bit, and this is a pretty significant addition to the substantive change policy, and it is the introduction of a new concept called substantive change restriction. There are situations in which an institution has additional or different substantive change obligations if they are on what we're going to call, at least to begin with, substantive change restriction. It may limit what you do. It may apply different thresholds. It may have different set of criteria for you if your institution qualifies for as being on substantive change restriction. If your institution is or has been placed on sanction, which would be warning, probation, or probation for good cause, currently or within the prior 3 years, or if your institution is currently under provisional certification for federal financial aid programs, basically for Title IV programs, then the institution is considered on substantive change restriction. One of the features that we're going to show you that's in the new policy for every type of substantive change, there's an indicator as to whether or not that particular type of substantive change has different or additional requirements for an institution that is on substantive change restriction. All right. We're changing a couple of processes to help us identify institutions that are subject to substantive change restriction, because right now we don't know all of those things. For example, we don't know when an institution is on provisional certification because it's not something that we've had to know before, and we don't currently have access to that type of information. So we will ask you for every sub change that you're submitting, are you on reimbursement? Are you on provisional certification? Now, this is not on the slide, but let me go ahead and identify for you. There are 6 things that have restrictions placed on them if your institution is on a substantive change restriction. Again, it creates some additional obligations or has different thresholds for obligations that all institutions have. One is off-campus instructional sites. Institutions that are on substantive change restriction do not have the option of a limited review. All off-campus instructional sites must be approved through the extensive review process. Okay, that's the only restriction for sites. Okay, so if you're on restriction, you do not have access to limited review, invariant to the fact that you perhaps have had sites already approved through the extensive review process. All of them have to go through an extensive review. There's no limited review while you're on substantive change restriction. The other 5 are related to programs. And I have not committed these to memory yet, so I am looking at my notes to see what these are. For significant departure, the threshold for significant departure is 25% for institutions that are on substantive change restriction. It's 50%, as we discussed earlier, for all other institutions. So if your institution is on restriction, the threshold for significant departure requiring approval of a program is if it has 25% or more new content. And it's exclusive of general education if it happens to be an undergraduate program. If you are changing the program length in credit hours, it is that 25% threshold. If it's more than 25%, it requires approval, even if it doesn't change how long the average completion time for the student changes. So for most institutions, there's 2 criteria, both have to be met. If you're on restriction, only 1 criteria has to be met, and that's the length of the program, if the change is greater than 25% up or down. If you are adding an additional method of delivery, and remember the method of delivery is face-to-face, distance education, competency-based. If you are adding those for an institution not on restriction, it's a simple notification. If you're on restriction, adding that requires approval. Programs that are designed for prior learning. I think I mentioned as I was discussing that was notification only. The exception is institutions that are on restriction. If you are starting a program designed for prior learning, that requires approval. That may require approval if it's a significant departure. That will always apply, but that's an additional requirement if you happen to be on substantive change restriction. Also, your Title IV cooperative academic arrangements with a non-Title IV entity, the threshold for approval is 25% if you're not on restriction. Okay, for an institution that is on restriction, any engagement with the non-Title IV entity requires approval. So it could be anything over 0% would require approval. Whereas for most institutions, other institutions, that threshold would be 25%. Now, I did not put those on the handout for you. It is, and I read that directly from the draft of the new policy. So I didn't put it on the slide. Probably, maybe I should have, but I just wanted you to see what the additional requirements are for institutions that are on restriction. And remember, that applies if you're on provisional certification for your federal aid, or if you are currently on any sanction or have been on sanction in the prior 3 years, the last 3 years. Okay. All right, we have about 15 minutes left, I believe. So I want to shift gears a little bit and go to item number 3, or part 3 of our discussion. We talked about the premise or the rationale. We talked about the content of the change in those 4 categories. Now let's talk for just a few minutes about implementation and perhaps some suggested practices or takeaways as you're getting ready to ready yourself in your institution for the new substantive change policy. This is one of the handouts that I provide, that I pointed you to at the beginning of the session today, and it is a crosswalk, a very basic crosswalk between the current policy and the policy that is now the current policy, which we're calling the 2020 or the revised policy. And I basically took the policy and put it in 2 columns and said, this was in the policy before and now it's changed or gone, or it wasn't in the policy before and now it's been added. It is about 3 pages. It is for reference only. It's a starting point. It does not cover every single change in the policy. There are hundreds and hundreds of changes that were made in the policy. These are the highlights. There's maybe 25 or so in that crosswalk. That is to get you started. For those of you who went through the conversion from the previous principles to the current principles, which was, I believe, in 2018. I think they're still referred to as the 2018 principles. The same thing was done. You could crosswalk. Here's what the old one was. Here's what the new one is. Here's what's gone. Here's what's been added. Here's what's been changed. That's the same rationale that I use, and I borrowed from how that was done with the principles a few years ago. But this is to get you started so you can have an anchor in what you already know in the current policy and what are the new or different requirements or eliminated requirements going forward. This is a lot to absorb, and it will have very different implications for different institutions. So reviewing it and understanding it and then interpreting it is a process. It's not an event. So it will take some additional time, even after the policy comes out. It takes a while to digest it. I still don't have hardly any of it committed to memory, and I've been looking at this every day for at least the last 6 months. It's going to take time for that to happen. So what I would suggest is you keep your eyes and ears open for the topic-specific webinars, and we'll start those in January. The questions that you're answering today have informed what I think should be probably the initial topics that we have. Probably the extensive review for off-campus instructional sites is one of them. Perhaps substantive change restrictions should be one of the early ones. But you'll inform me as to what you think is most important, and that's how we'll start doing our webinars. We will start doing workshops again. I hope we'll be able to do this in the summer or the fall as soon as we're able to travel. We cannot do them in the spring. There is no travel through at least the end of June. Nothing takes the place of face-to-face meetings, so we're still going to get our substantive change, all-day substantive change workshops out on the road just as quickly as we can once we get a handle on the pandemic. And you might also begin thinking about reviewing through whatever process there is in place at your institution, your institutional substantive change policy. Because as you know, your institutional policy must address all types of substantive change that are defined in policy. All of that is new. All of your institutional process policy is going to have to be changed, and most importantly, changing processes. So you have something in place to identify substantive changes and what your obligations are before you actually implement those. That's a big deal. This is we understand that, and we're going to work with you on those as well. One of the things I certainly learned in going through any type of large-scale change at my institution when I was still at an academic institution, and have learned since being here with new principles, new policies, new regulations, is it's a struggle. I'm not sure who the two parties are in this visual representation, but we are going to be pushing somewhat against each other for a while, perhaps just to understand what the requirements are. We probably ought to have a third party in there, because it's SACSCOC, it's the outside regulators where most of these changes are coming from. To what end? I'll leave that to other people to decide, but it is what it is. And so we will work with you as we work through the process of implementing the new policy. We do want to point out some features of the policy. So I'm going to ask my colleague, Robin Zuniga, to walk through part of that with you. And then we'll come back to some questions.
Yes, by now you have probably noticed that the policy is organized very differently than the previous policy, and that was intentional. We based the organization on the way that the institution sees substantive changes rather than the SACSCOC processes. So where we had Procedure 1, Procedure 2, Procedure 3, which were SACSCOC procedure based, you'll now see that the policy is organized by the type of change: institutional changes, off-campus instructional sites, and program changes. And many of the things that were separated out, like closures for Procedure 3, are under those type of change headings. So it's not going to be as, hopefully it'll be more intuitive to you when you're thinking about what kind of a change you're trying to make at your institution for you to find the change in the policy. Also, the policy is now designed to be used more as an electronic document. You can always print it if you want to, but there are links within it, and you can jump around the policy and find what you need by just going online to the website, and that will be up in the near future. Another feature is that we have added now Appendix A is really important to you, because it is going to outline what you are to submit for each type of approval. So every substantive change that needs to have a prospectus for approval, that's not just a letter of notification, we have given you an outline of the things that you need to include in your prospectus. So now you will have an outline that you can copy and paste and use as a template for writing your prospectus. I hope that you find that easier, and that's very helpful for you, so that you'll be able to really check off everything that you need to submit, all of the information that you need, and have a much more efficient process for designing your prospectus. Also, another feature is that as you go to each substantive change in the policy and procedures, you will see that there is a little box, a cheat sheet, so to speak, that tells you what kind of requirement this substantive change requires. Is it a notification or approval? Does it go to the full board or the EC? And then, does it require a committee visit, or is that conditional on something? And does it require a fee? Now here it'll just say yes or no if there is a fee required, and you'll need to go to the fee schedule to determine how much the fee is going to be. And there are some changes to fees coming. Not right away, probably not until summer, but there are some fee changes. And then it tells you if it's subject to the substantive change restriction. So if it says no, then it doesn't matter whether you're on sanction or provisional certification or not. It will apply to everyone equally. However, if it says yes there, then you need to go back and understand whether or not you're on the substantive change restriction or not, and what changes that will make to what's required from you for that substantive change. Okay, the other thing is, in order to help facilitate that process of knowing whether you need special types of requirements need to be met, we have created a new cover sheet, which needs to be accompanied with all submissions. And on this cover sheet, one of the most important aspects of it is that you will be asked a set of screening questions to determine if you are under substantive change restriction or under some other restriction that might require special handling of that substantive change. So if you ask, under the substantive change restriction, if you answer yes to any of the 3 questions that are there, you are under substantive change restriction. And from the outset, you should know that you have special requirements. And so you should go and make sure that you are following those requirements when you are submitting your substantive change. And let's go to questions, as I see some interesting questions actually related to that. One of the questions was, how long does a substantive change restriction last? And I guess that answer to that is sort of that it depends.
It does. It depends on why you're on restriction. Remember, one is time-based and event-based, and the other is an event only. So you're on restriction while you're on sanction, and for 3 years after sanction. Now we haven't sort of parsed through the details yet of exactly what that date would be, and we'll get you some guidance on that, because that will affect what you're doing going forward. As I recall, the federal regulations said for 3 academic years after. So we have to figure out exactly when that clock starts running. We'll let you know. We're not going to let you be disadvantaged by not knowing that. But at the outset, we don't have that ready for you. The other is provisional certification. And so if you're on provisional certification, you're on restriction. And if that's removed, then you're off of restriction, assuming there's no sanction. So it's time-based, but what starts the time base is an event. That's for the first set of criteria, which is sanctions. The second criteria is just an event, if you're on provisional certification or not.
Okay, I do want to make the point, though, that if you're on provisional certification or reimbursement for financial aid, at the time when you submit the prospectus, then that prospectus is going to be handled based on the fact that you were on it when you submitted it. If you should leave provisional certification or go off reimbursement during the time that we're working on it, we are still going to handle it as if you were on reimbursement or provisional certification.
So Carmen, do we have other questions? I know we're running out of time. I think we only have maybe 5 minutes left, but we'll try to pack in as many as we can.
Well, I'll try to speak quickly. Okay. Will the new policy impact a level change from level 2 to 3, for example? And if so, in which ways?
I don't believe there's any change to the current policy on level change. There were a couple of things that we clarified, but that's just in how it was presented. There were no material changes to much of anything at the institutional level changes, except a few things that, like the restrictions and a few things that now require institutional level review, like an extensive review for off-campus instructional site. I don't believe there's any, there's no change to level change. You said from 2 to 3, no change in that whatsoever.
Okay. And will sub changes be submitted via the SACSCOC portal instead of hard copy?
Yes, that is moving along. I don't know exactly what the timeline is on that. I think it's going to be fairly soon. It is up and running. We've been testing it. Now we're going to have to go back and change some things because we have different screening questions now based on the new policy. That won't take a terribly long time to do. So I would expect that fairly soon, but I can't give you a timeline because that's outside of my domain. So I leave that to the IT experts, but it will be coming fairly soon. You can always submit now on electronic media by shipping it to us. That's fine. If you don't, there's no reason to wait for the online portal to be open. So if you need to submit something, just submit it. I will say if you can put it on a flash drive, that makes things go much quicker for us. And so we can get it in the queue for you a little bit sooner. And I would also suggest, I did add this to the website, if you're going to send something to us, particularly to meet that January 1 deadline, we would strongly suggest that you use any carrier other than the U.S. Postal Service, because their deliveries have become, the delivery times are very long, weeks sometimes for fairly short distances, and they're just too unreliable. So use any other carrier that you want.
Okay, and Kevin, what's the recommended course of action for programs that would not have qualified as a sub-change previously, but do qualify now and are in the process for activation in fall of 2021?
Well, if it's for fall 2021 and it requires approval, really notification too, those should be submitted by January 1st. That's the deadline for anything submitted, anything that's going to be implemented after July 1st. So if you're implementing in the fall, do whatever you have to do to get that in by the January 1st deadline. That's the deadline anyway, so that should be your goal to meet that deadline. It's particularly important this year because if it does come in and is dated after January 1st, we're really going to have to hold the institution to the new policy. So, you know, that's the way it is.
Okay, and any guidance for institutions submitting compliance certification in March for the class of 2022?
Nope, I wouldn't dare touch that one. That is outside of my scope of knowledge. So I will point you to your SACSCOC vice president, and they are the experts in that, and I'll let them handle that. I don't think there's any, I will say this, I don't think there's any impact on your compliance certification as a result of the substantive change, the change in the substantive change policy. Again, I would have that conversation with your vice president, even if your compliance certification is due in March. I don't see that having any impact at all going forward. I would think you were probably going to have to revisit your institutional substantive change policy, which we've already identified whether or not that would be expected to be in place by March. I kind of doubt it. But I would point to them. I will go ahead and end this now because they will automatically cut us off. So thank you all very much for attending and participating. I know you'll have questions. We will do our best to get the policy out to you as soon as possible and get your questions answered as you move forward in the process of implementing the new policy. So again, thank you all very much.
And thank you. We will have the questions will be downloaded, and please go over to the Pathable site and click here to evaluate the session button and evaluate the session, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you.